Welcome back to Political Science 201. This is Laura Fleming, and this is our third online lecture. Here's a thought question to get us warmed up. Should it be easy to change the Constitution? Why or why not? We know the Constitution was not a perfect document. In fact, the founders admitted that. We talked about this on the introductory day of class, where Hamilton said, "I never expect to see a perfect work from imperfect man." So we know the Constitution is not perfect. We know that it may need to be changed from time to time as circumstances change. But the question is, how easy should it be to change the Constitution? And when you think about it, you realize this should not be an easy process. That should not be a lightly undertaken process, because the Constitution is the fundamental law of our land. It's the foundation of our government, and you don't want to go around changing a foundational document willy-nilly. So let's talk about how the Constitution can be changed. We're going to talk about how the Constitution and federal powers have changed over time. We're going to start with the Bill of Rights. These were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And then we're going to talk about periods in American history where the powers of the federal government have changed and developed. So the first major period of American history we're going to talk about is the Civil War and the amendments to the Constitution that took place in the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. Next, we'll talk about the Progressive Era. This was about 100 years ago in the very early 1900s, and the amendments that took place in the aftermath of that big change. Then we'll talk about from Great Depression to Great Recession. We'll talk about FDR and his conception of federal power all the way through to modern times. So basically, this is an overview of American history, focusing on changes to the conception of the powers of the national government. If you've had an American history class in high school, this will be helpful to you. If you have not much background in American history, it's going to be a lot to absorb. So feel free to go back and listen to the lecture and review the PowerPoints as much as you need to get familiar with these very important eras in American history. The founders provided for amendments to the Constitution. This is in Article 5, which you can find on page 108 of your accessible Federalist. Article 5 says, "The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to the Constitution." This means that it takes a supermajority, 67 senators, 288 representatives, just to propose an amendment, just to get an amendment on the table. And the amendment is not automatically effective. The amendment then has to be ratified state by state. So Article 5 goes on to say that when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, the amendments will become effective. Okay, so 2/3 of Congress to propose an amendment, and then 3/4 of the states to ratify the amendment state by state. Again, the founders made it difficult to amend the Constitution because this is the foundational document of our government. There's another way to propose amendments. This has not really been used before, but basically the states, if the states feel that Congress has gone off the rails and Congress is not proposing necessary amendments, the states can call a constitutional convention with participation of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states. So amendments can be proposed either by Congress, that's the normal means, a supermajority of Congress, or amendments can be proposed by a supermajority of the states, but then they have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states in order to become effective. Let's talk about the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. These are called the Bill of Rights. Remember that these were requested, basically demanded by the Anti-Federalists. Now, the Federalists, the ones who designed the original Constitution, they believed the Bill of Rights was unnecessary and perhaps even dangerous. Okay, this is kind of a foreign way of thinking to us today. But basically, the Federalists said, look, we have put protections for your freedom into the structure of the Constitution. This is what we talked about last time. The fact that our Constitution is representative, so the people form a protection against too much federal power. Our Constitution has separation of power into branches and checks and balances. Our Constitution has a federalist system where power is reserved to the state government. So all of these things, according to the Federalists, were protections for our freedom baked into the cake, into the structure of the Constitution. And they didn't really see the need to spell it out further. This is from Federalist 84, Federalist Essay 84. It's not in your accessible Federalist. I'm going to read it to you from the original. Hamilton saying, I affirm that bills of rights, in the sense and to the extent in which they are contended for, are not only unnecessary in the proposed Constitution, but would even be dangerous. They would contain various exceptions to powers which are not granted, and on this very account would afford a colorable pretext to claim more than were granted. Basically, Hamilton's saying, why declare that things shall not be done which there is no power to do? Why, for instance, should it be said the liberty of the press shall not be restrained when no power is given by which restrictions may be imposed? In other words, Hamilton's saying, look at Article 1, Section 8, the list of federal powers. I don't see the ability to interfere with speech or religion or the press in that list if they don't have that power anyway. Why are we telling them not to do it? As an example, it might be, let's say my youngest son Jacob was 14. He's older now, but let's say when he was 14, I had gone to him and said, Jacob, you may not drive the car with your girlfriend after dark. Okay, and you can see the wheels turning in his head, and he's thinking, oh, maybe that means that I can drive the car with my girlfriend before dark, or maybe that means that I can drive the car after dark with my friend who just happens to be a girl. I promise, Mom, we're just friends, right? So the wheels are turning in Jacob's head about all the things that he can do, when in reality, he can't do any of these things. Why am I telling him don't drive the car after dark with your girlfriend when he's only 14 and he doesn't have a license anyway? That's what the founders were saying. They were saying, why do we want to put ideas in the government's head? Nonetheless, the Anti-Federalists, they said, that's cute. We don't buy it. We want written protection for individual rights. And the promise of a Bill of Rights was necessary to achieve ratification of the Constitution. So you'll remember that in order to get the Anti-Federalists to ratify the Constitution, the Federalists agreed the very first item on the table would be these first 10 amendments. So it's important to understand what kind of document the Bill of Rights is. Okay, the Bill of Rights is a list. Okay, it's a list. It's a different kind of list from Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8 is a list of the powers of the national government, and it's supposed to be an exclusive list. You only get those powers in Article 1, Section 8. Bill of Rights is different. Bill of Rights is also a list, but this list is intended to be an example. Okay, so the rights or the freedoms in the Bill of Rights are not limited to those on the list. These are just examples of some of our important or favorite freedoms, but our freedoms are not limited to the Bill of Rights. So two different kinds of lists. Article 1, Section 8, the federal government is limited to the powers in that list, but Bill of Rights, Americans are not limited to just the rights in the Bill of Rights. You should also know the Bill of Rights is a charter of negative freedom. Bill of Rights guarantees freedom from government interference in our speech, religion, right to bear arms, etc. We talked about negative freedom last time. Negative freedom is government, leave me alone freedom. The Bill of Rights is all about government, leave me alone. Sometimes we get a little sloppy, right? And we say the First Amendment gives us freedom of speech, or the First Amendment gives us freedom of religion. That's wrong, okay? The First Amendment does not give us anything because the founders believed that these freedoms are not the government's to give. Okay, we have these freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc., as part of our birthright as human beings. These come from our Creator. They don't come from the government. The government cannot give us freedom, but unfortunately, the government absolutely can take our freedoms away. And so what the Bill of Rights does is it says Americans have these freedoms. They don't come from the government, but we recognize a powerful government could potentially take these freedoms away, and that's where we're going to say, government, leave us alone. These freedoms are especially protected. Okay, a charter of negative freedom. This is made clear in the last two amendments, so kind of the neglected amendments of the Bill of Rights. Okay, if you look at your Accessible Federalist starting on page 109, the Articles 1 through 10 are, of course, the Bill of Rights. Article 9 says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. This explains, again, emphasizes the Bill of Rights is not an exhaustive list. It's a list of examples. You cannot use the Bill of Rights to deny additional rights to the people. Then you have the 10th Amendment. 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. This 10th Amendment is referring back to that other list in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. And it says, Article 1, Section 8, that delegates powers to the national government. That is an exclusive list. That is all the powers that the federal government is supposed to get. And if that list in Article 1, Section 8 does not give a power to the United States, that power is therefore reserved to the states and to the people. Okay, 9th Amendment says Bill of Rights is a list of examples. 10th Amendment says, but Article 1, Section 8, that is an exclusive list. Those are all the powers the national government gets. And any other powers that are out there, those are reserved for the states and the people. Okay, spoiler alert. The federal government today is much bigger than it was at the time of the founders. One way to look at this would be federal government spending as a share of gross domestic product or as a share of the economy. You can see as recently as 100 years ago that the government was only a couple percentage points of our economy. Now, the economy has grown dramatically in the past 100 years, but the power, the spending of the national government has grown even faster. So you can see more recently, federal government spending is now close to a quarter of our economy. And if you add in state and local government spending, then you're going to get, maybe 40% of the economy. So a huge portion of the economy is dominated by the government, and especially the national government. Now you'll see two spikes on this graph here. You'll see a spike in the 19-teens and another spike in the mid-1940s. And you can see these spikes are mostly red, which stands for defense costs. And of course, these two spikes in spending represent the two world wars. The First World War in the late 19-teens, and the Second World War in the mid-1940s. Obviously, when there's a war going on, especially a world war, the government is going to spend more. But the interesting thing that you notice is after the war ends, spending goes down, but it doesn't go all the way down to baseline. And again, after World War II, spending does go down, but it does not go all the way down to baseline. And the fact is that the government tends to grow during times of war and insecurity. I'm going to read a short quote from the textbook here, Understanding American Government, page 12. Talking about the Obama administration, and the textbook is generally in favor of the Obama administration. Okay, so the textbook does not critique or criticize President Obama. It's generally favorable toward the former president. So here's the textbook. He says the Obama administration proposed an ambitious domestic agenda calling for healthcare reform, climate change measures, and education reform, as well as stabilizing the economy, all in the president's first term. Okay, so President Obama had a big agenda that he wanted to accomplish. Obama's chief of staff, referring to the recession, so some of you may not remember this very well, but back in 2008, we were having a recession in our economy. And Obama's chief of staff said, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. He explained that Americans are more willing to let the government take action during a crisis than at other times. Okay, when there's a war or other crisis like a recession, or as we're experiencing today, the coronavirus crisis, Americans are more fearful and we want security from our government. Remember, we talked about this trade-off between freedom and security. So every action the government takes to provide us with more security has a decrease in our personal freedom. But people are more willing to trade their personal freedoms when they're feeling unsafe and unsecure. So government tends to grow during times of war and insecurity. Even after the crisis is over, the government remains larger than before. The government has a hard time scaling itself back down, right? And I have a quote from the textbook here, page 6. Once government grows, it creates new clients for its services. These clients then make it difficult for the government to cut back. This is true whether the clients are low-income individuals or huge corporations. So basically, when the government acts, it creates quote-unquote clients, or that's a nice way to put it. We could also say people become dependent on these government programs. We'll talk about this, whether it's poor people become dependent, or large corporations become dependent, or anybody that the government gives subsidies to during the time of crisis, they start to like those subsidies, and it makes it very difficult, politically very difficult, to ratchet those back. That's one of the things I'm worried about in this coronavirus crisis, that the government will take actions for relief which are needed on a temporary basis, but then people will become dependent on those actions, and they'll continue to the detriment of our freedom, especially our freedom to do what we want with our money. You know, taxes may have to increase to pay for these measures, which may be needed on a temporary basis, but because these measures may accumulate clients and dependency, they could endure for longer than needed and interfere with our freedoms. Bottom line is that over time, Americans have come to expect more from our federal government. So we expect all kinds of things that our founders would never have expected from the national government. Today, the federal government is involved in every aspect of our lives. This is a special bookcase that one of the senators, Senator Mike Lee, had in his office. And this bookcase represents federal regulations. This is 80,000 pages of federal regulations. So what happens is, we'll talk about this when we talk about the bureaucracy, but what happens is these government agencies, they're issuing all these rules and regulations. They publish these regulations in something called the Federal Register, which is like a little magazine of regulations, and the senator collected all these, put them in a bookcase. This is what 80,000 pages of regulations looks like. These are the regulations passed in just 1 year, 80,000 pages in 1 year, 2013, the year that he had this bookcase. There are approximately 3 million civilian federal government workers, so a lot of people working for the government. Almost half the population receives some form of government benefits. In fact, the number of people who are on welfare is actually more than the number of people with full-time jobs. And in 35 states, welfare, including all the various benefits available, pays more than the minimum wage. So you can see we've really become dependent on the federal government and also state government programs as well. And the question is, what exactly happened to the limited government of the founders? What happened to the national government only doing national government stuff and staying within the boundaries of Article 1, Section 8? So that's what we're going to talk about today. Our first stop in American history is going to be the Civil War. We talked about the fact that disagreement between the North and the South was already evident in the Constitution. So this was evident especially in the 3/5 Compromise, the argument over how slaves are going to count for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. There was also argument about taxes, about which region would be dominant and would the regions pay their fair share. So this conflict eventually erupted into a civil war. 11 of the southern states seceded from the Union. They said, we're leaving, we don't want to be part of the United States anymore. And the most obvious reason was slavery. There were also other factors, taxes, argument over which region would be dominated, and this war went on for 4 or 5 years, 1861 to 1865. So the North, also known as the Union, fought to keep the southern states in the United States. They said, no, you can't secede, we're one nation. So the Union and the South also called the Confederacy, fought this very bloody civil war. Over 600,000 Americans died. President Abraham Lincoln led the Union during this time. He was a very powerful president. And one of the actions that he took was he issued an executive order called the Emancipation Proclamation. This is where he freed the slaves. What's interesting about the Emancipation Proclamation is that it was a wartime order, and it freed the slaves in the rebel states only. Okay, so it didn't free all of the slaves. There were some slave states that actually were still part of the United States, still part of the Union. President Lincoln didn't want to disrupt those states, but he did feel as a wartime measure he wanted to encourage the slaves in the rebel states to rise up and join the cause of the Union. President Lincoln made other uses of his executive power, including declaring martial law. So you'll see these strong presidents emerge during times of crisis. I want to talk to you about President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Okay, so this was a speech that Lincoln gave. He was dedicating a graveyard, dedicating a memorial to those who had fallen during the Civil War. And it's a very famous speech, not super long. I'm going to read it to you here. He started out, he was dedicating the Soldiers National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. That's why it's called the Gettysburg Address. And he starts out 87 years ago. That's a fancy way of saying 87 years ago. And he's referring back to the Declaration of Independence, that founding document. So he says, 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So he's hearkening back to our core founding values of liberty and equality. Lincoln goes on, now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. What you notice about the Gettysburg Address is that Lincoln says nation many times, nation, nation, nation. He's trying to emphasize the importance of the United States as a nation. He does not use the word states once. Okay, so he's saying we're not a collection of sovereign and independent states. We're a nation. Lincoln goes on and he winds down his speech in the last little bit. He says, we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So Lincoln is calling the United States back to the founding vision of freedom and equality, while at the same time kind of modifying that vision a little bit, emphasizing that we are a nation, we're not a collection of sovereign states. So as you all know, the national government, the Union, eventually won the war. So the South was not successful in their efforts to leave the United States. Good things came out of this difficult time. Ultimately, slavery was ended, and that was a moral good. But there were trade-offs as well. In addition to the hundreds of thousands of people that died, there was also an impact on federalism. Okay, this was the end of states believing that they had autonomy. States didn't have that kind of trump card in their back pocket that if the United States took measures that they seriously disagreed with and they weren't able to resolve it through negotiations in Congress, you know, states were thinking in the back of their mind, we can always, take our toys and go home. We can leave the Union. And the Union, the North, said, no, that's off the table. That's not an option. And so this significantly hindered the ability of the states to check national power. Strong state governments are a form of separation of power. They can serve as a check on the national government getting too big and too powerful. After the Civil War, state power was significantly weakened, and so this protection for our freedom that the founders had set up was also significantly weakened. So again, slavery needed to go. I would point out that, other countries were able to eliminate slavery without this kind of violent measures. Okay, so Great Britain was able to end slavery peacefully. It's too bad that the United States was not able also to end slavery peacefully. Instead, we had this very bloody Civil War, which ended with the erosion of the power of the state governments to check the power of the national government. Okay, so the period after the Civil War was called Reconstruction or Rebuilding, and 3 new amendments were passed during this time period. And you can find these amendments in your constitutions, of course, starting on page 112 of the Accessible Federalist. So we're talking about Articles 13, 14, and 15, those amendments. 13th Amendment abolished slavery, okay, the very first amendment after the Civil War. And you may think, wait a minute, I thought President Lincoln did that. I thought the Emancipation Proclamation abolished slavery. Well, it did, except there were a couple problems. First of all, Emancipation Proclamation only abolished slavery in the southern states, the rebel states, and we wanted a complete prohibition of slavery. That's number one. Number two, Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order by the president, one person. We'll see that these executive orders are kind of easy come, easy go. So if one person issues an executive order, not that difficult for the next president to revoke the executive order. So we believe that the abolition of slavery was so important, it needed to be incorporated into the Constitution. Remember, it's very difficult to change the Constitution. So we wanted this prohibition on slavery to be part of our foundational legal document that could not be easily changed. Then we have the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment, fairly lengthy. I'm going to read an excerpt here. This is page 112 of the Accessible Federalist. It says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. States can't interfere with the privileges of people from other states. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the law. Basically, the 14th Amendment said states must guarantee equal protection. They need to protect all citizens equally under the law, and it also guaranteed due process. Due process, it just means a fair process, a fair legal process. So the states have to provide a fair legal process, in particular of people who have been accused of a crime, and they must also protect all citizens equally. This is very interesting for a number of reasons. First, the Bill of Rights was aimed primarily at the national government. Okay, so the anti-federalists were worried about a powerful national government, and they wanted to protect certain freedoms from the national government. 14th Amendment is different. 14th Amendment is aimed at the states. So the United States was concerned, the nation was concerned that certain states, particularly the southern states, were not going to treat people equally and fairly. And so basically this 14th Amendment says that the states may not discriminate. And they must treat people equally. They must give them fair legal process. Okay, so that's basically the meaning of the 14th Amendment in a nutshell. Then you have the 15th Amendment. 15th Amendment says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So the 15th Amendment removed race restrictions on voting. It said that the nation and the states, nobody basically can put restrictions on the ability to vote depending on your race or whether you used to be a slave. At the time, each state made its own rules about who could vote. So in some states, Black Americans could vote, and some they could not. Here, 15th Amendment basically gets rid of any requirements for voting based on race or previous slave status. And the point of these amendments, was to integrate former black slaves into American political life. So these amendments freed the slaves, guaranteed that the states would treat them equally and fairly, and allowed them to vote. Now, it did take a while for America to live into these amendments. Okay, it took a while for these amendments to actually be effective. Nonetheless, the seeds were there in the late 1870s. Okay, so after the Reconstruction period, after the nation rebuilt from the Civil War, you come to a period of time, late 1800s, called the Industrial Revolution. This was a period of great changes. Actually, a very exciting period, a lot of developments. So you had the development of fast trains, so trains that run on steam engines and railroads that were crisscrossing the country. You had the development of telegraph technology, so people being able to communicate across great distances by telegraph. You had the growth of large cities, tall buildings. So before this, you mostly had agricultural or rural states, but now you're getting urbanization, large cities, tall buildings, lots of really cool inventions. Edison inventing the light bulb and discovering electricity and harnessing that for technological use. You have innovations in food preparation and refrigeration. So these developments really changed the nature of American society, changed the nature of the American family. So it was a very exciting time, but also kind of disconcerting. A lot of uncertainty and a lot of new problems began to arise. So in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, we have a period of time called the Progressive Era, which we're going to talk about next. Let's talk a little bit about the Progressive Era that followed on the heels of the Industrial Revolution. So this was the late 1800s through early 1900s, a period of social and political reform. Basically, the progressives were idealists. You can see from the name progressive, they believed in progress. They had seen all of the inventions of the Industrial Revolution, all of the improvements to transportation and communication and home economics. And they felt that these principles these scientific efforts could be used to improve society, to improve the human condition. They wanted to apply science to things like poverty and crime. Okay, so they were really wanted to improve society. And one of the big emphases during the progressive era was efficiency. This was the time of the assembly line. Everybody was in the assembly putting together their little piece, and the more efficient you could be, the more little pieces you could put together. You could maximize your output. One of my favorite books about the progressive era is a book called Cheaper by the Dozen. If you've never heard of Cheaper by the Dozen, I encourage you to check it out. There was a movie starring Steve Martin that did kind of a modern remake of this family, but the idea is that you have a family with 12 kids. The original Cheaper by the Dozen family lived in the progressive era, and their dad was an efficiency expert. So their dad would actually go to assembly lines and analyze each little movement of the assembly line workers, each little even glances, and rearrange the work environment to make it more efficient. And the funny part of this book was when this dad would take efficiency principles home and try and apply them to his dozen children, thus the name of the book, Cheaper by the Dozen, and all sorts of hijinks and hilarity would result. Okay, so efficiency was a big deal during the progressive era. So what is the most efficient way to get things done? You know, quite frankly, government can be a very efficient way to get things done, and the progressives believed in a more active role by the central government. We'll come back to this. You know, this creates a tension because remember, our founders, when they created a central national government, they took great pains to make sure it was not too powerful and not too efficient. But here come the progressives, and they'd like to see government assist in helping society make progress in an efficient manner, and that creates a conflict that we'll come back to. Women also began to get involved in politics and organize for voting rights. So the Industrial Revolution really changed the lives of women. In particular, a lot of the innovations, including electricity and improvements in food storage, allowed women to have more free time to think about politics and to organize. Also, we'll see that the men of the household were now away from home, working in the factories, and that created a kind of disruption. So we'll see that women began to get involved, and they brought what we might call a more maternal aspect of government. So this idea, and they themselves spoke of it as a maternal aspect of government, they brought to the picture the idea that perhaps government should do more in terms of caring for the citizens and nurturing the citizens. And again, that means a more active role. And the more active the government is, the more freedoms you have to give up in the process. Let's talk a little bit about Woodrow Wilson. Okay, Wilson was a progressive president during the First World War, right at the height of that progressive era. He had a PhD in political science. Okay, he was an academic. He actually wrote a dissertation about 20 years before he became president. And in his dissertation, he criticized the Constitution. This is very interesting. So Wilson was a progressive reformer, a critic of the Constitution, even during grad school in the late 1800s. And due to the magic of the internet, you can actually access and read Woodrow Wilson's PhD dissertation written in 1885. So I'm going to read you some little excerpts from his dissertation here, and you can hear how he was definitely a critic of the Constitution. He says, he sort of comments on the fact that opposition to the Constitution as a constitution and even hostile criticism of its provisions ceased almost immediately upon its adoption. So he's saying that, you know, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, they had a lot of argument back and forth before the Constitution was adopted. But after the Constitution was adopted, everybody pretty much accepted it. And Wilson says not only did criticism of the Constitution cease, but it gave place to an undiscriminating and almost blind worship of its principles and of the delicate dual system of sovereignty and complicated scheme of double administration which it established. So he's kind of marveling about the fact that once our Constitution was ratified, that people, according to Wilson, almost blindly worshiped this document, even though it's a little complicated. We talked about the fact that the Constitution set up by the founders is complicated and it does have inefficiencies. Wilson goes on, he says, we of the present generation, the generation of 1885, are in the first season of free, outspoken, unrestrained constitutional criticism. We are the first Americans to hear our own countrymen ask whether the Constitution is still adapted to serve the purposes for which it was intended, the first to entertain any serious doubts about the superiority of our own institution compared with the systems of Europe. So he says, we're standing up, the generation of 1885, and we're questioning the Constitution. Is our system really better than the systems of Europe? And you'll hear that today. The progressives of today will also say things like, hey, you know, why do we do things in this uniquely American way, and would it be better to do things in the way of the Europeans? Okay, the founders of our Constitution were trying to create a new kind of system, deliberately different from the systems of Europe. But here we have Wilson and the progressives saying, you know, was that really the right decision? Here he is again. He says, the times seem to favor a centralization of governmental functions such as could not have suggested itself as a possibility to the framers of the Constitution. He says we live in new times, the people of the late 1800s, and it seems like we need more government centralization. He goes on, he talks about what Hicks, the founders, were. He says, since they gave their work to the world, the whole face of that world has changed. The Constitution was adopted when it was 6 days hard traveling from New York to Boston, when to cross the East River was to venture a perilous voyage, when men were thankful for weekly mail, when the extent of the country's commerce was reckoned not in millions but in thousands of dollars. Of course, today, now our economy is reckoned in the trillions of dollars. Wilson goes on, the country knew few cities. We'd only just begun manufacturing. There were Indians still pressing upon our near frontiers. And get this, at the time of the founders, they were so backwards, there were no telegraph lines. Okay, so Wilson says, hey, you know, we're urbane, we're sophisticated, we have telegraph lines. He goes on, he says, it seems probable to many that whether by constitutional amendment or still further flights of construction, yet broader territory will at no very distant day be assigned to the federal government. So he's saying it's time to give more power to the national government, either by amending the Constitution or by reinterpreting the Constitution. And that's exactly what has happened. So we'll talk about that process. When Wilson became president, he called his progressive agenda the New Freedom. Now let me ask you, when Wilson's talking about this new freedom, do you think he's talking about positive freedom or negative freedom? Well, remember, the founders were all about the negative freedom. They were all about government, leave me alone. Wilson is a progressive. He's talking about a new kind of freedom. He's talking about the positive freedom. He's talking about, hey, government, don't leave me alone. Come in and help me reach my potential. Government, help me. Okay, this is his new agenda. His policies created the Federal Reserve System to regulate the economy and the Department of Labor to regulate the workplace, among other government programs. So I'd just like to point out, we have had over 100 years of economic regulation as well as labor regulation. Have we gotten it right yet? Well, I don't know. I don't know that we're quite there in terms of progress. That's one of the problems with these government programs, is that you never quite get where you want to go. So the question is, where did the federal government get funding for these new initiatives? Because the more the government grows, the more money it needs. And we talked about the fact that up until this time, the national government had basically two ways of getting money under the Constitution. So it could levy import and export taxes. And that's very delicate because those have implications for trade, and you could inadvertently start a trade war. So you don't want to tax imports and exports too much. You don't want to rely on that too much. Under the Constitution, you could also tax the population, but that would have to be apportioned among the states. So the state governments would kind of be a barrier to taxing the American people directly. So we really needed an extra source of funding during the Progressive era, and this has to do with the very first amendment to the Constitution during the Progressive era. There are actually 4 amendments passed during the Progressive era. You can find these in your Accessible Federalist. So if you go to page 113, it's Article 16 XVI. For those of you who are a little rusty on your Roman numerals, you can write progressive right there next to Article 16. It says, Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. So in other words, the government now has the power to tax the income of American citizens directly without worrying about apportionment among the states by population. The national government finally got access to the incomes of the people to pay for bigger government. Next, we have the 17th Amendment, which is kind of interesting. Has to do with the election of senators. We'll talk more about this when we talk about Congress, but basically senators were designed to represent the states as states, to represent the states equally. And at the beginning, under the original Constitution, senators were chosen by state legislatures. So for example, Louisiana, the state legislature in Baton Rouge would have chosen 2 senators to go and represent Louisiana. The progressives felt that this dual system of sovereignty, federalism, the idea that state governments had a form of sovereign power, they felt that that complicated things and was not very efficient, and they wanted to emphasize the direct relationship between the people and the national government. One of the ways that they did that is through the 17th Amendment. So instead of state governments choosing senators, now the American people were going to elect senators directly. Okay, so this is kind of an end run around state governments, allowing the American people to directly vote for senators. We have always directly voted for members of the House of Representatives, and so this allowed Americans to also vote for senators directly for the purpose. One of the purposes was to reduce state power. We have the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment instituted prohibition. Okay, we'll talk about this in just a minute, but basically, prohibition prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol. Okay, so that's very interesting. They outlawed alcohol. This is evidence of the influence of women in government. The women were behind this new policy, and we'll talk more about it in just a few minutes. The institution of prohibition did not go well, and eventually prohibition was repealed. Okay, so today you may have some regulation of alcohol at the state or local level. So for example, in Ruston, you're not allowed to buy alcohol in the grocery stores on Sundays, but we don't have any national or federal prohibition of alcohol anymore because prohibition was repealed later by the 21st Amendment. Then we have the 19th Amendment giving women the vote. Okay, so this is very interesting. Our country is expanding the idea of freedom and equality. So first, we eliminated any laws preventing people from voting based on their race. And then in 1920, we prevented any laws that would keep people from voting based on their sex. Okay, so the 19th Amendment gave women the vote. Let's do a little bit deeper dive into prohibition. Prohibition, everybody would agree today, was an example of government overreach. The intent of prohibition was good. Okay, so alcoholism was a big problem during the Progressive era. The men would come home from their jobs in the factory. They would stop by the bars. They would drink too much. They would spend up their paychecks, come home, be not very nice to their families. So the intent of prohibition, one of the goals was to break up the saloon culture and stop the effect of drunkenness on families. You might ask, why did they pass a constitutional amendment to do this? Well, if you look at the powers of the national government under Article 1, Section 8, you will not see the power to regulate alcohol. Okay, so at that time, the American public had not yet expanded the language, reinterpreted the language of the Commerce Clause and other powers under Article 1, Section 8 to include powers like prohibiting alcohol. So what they did is they amended the Constitution to prohibit alcohol. The problem is that prohibition created a black market for liquor, and it also strengthened organized crime because despite the fact that drunkenness was a big problem, people were just not willing to sacrifice their freedom to drink. They thought that the trade-off, the cost, was too high. During the era of prohibition, you would see propaganda type posters like this one, which says, "Safeguard the babies. Parents drinking weakens children's vitality." And then you see the use of science here. 1.3% of children of abstaining parents, so those would be the good teetotaling Baptists, are weakly. I don't know exactly how they came up with the parameters, which kids are weakly versus which kids are strongly, but nonetheless, only 1.3% of the children of abstaining parents were weak, and 8.2% of the children of drinking parents were weak. So they said, do it for the children. And they have a cute little picture of the Gerber baby with his face looking at you, very cute. Nonetheless, ultimately, people were not willing to sacrifice their freedom to drink, even for the babies. This is a kind of propaganda that's very effective. Okay, you'll often see politicians saying, "Do this for the children." We have natural protective instincts for children. Okay, when kids are born, they come out. They have the big eyes and the big cute little chipmunk cheeks and the little fat rolls on their arms and legs, and they're just adorable, and that's why they're still alive, okay, because children are a lot of work. And we are willing to give up quite a bit for kids. So for example, if you have your little brother or sister, or maybe your little cousin or niece or nephew come visit you at your apartment, you're willing to curtail your freedoms for a while. You're willing to give up certain freedoms. For example, you might watch your language. You might watch what you're watching on TV or the video games that you play. You might play Mario Kart instead of some other hardcore games that you've been playing. You'll find out when you have children of your own, it's just an unending process of giving up your freedoms. Your freedom to sleep when you want, your freedom to move around where you want to go without worrying about kids. But we're willing to do this because we know that kids are the future generation. But at some point you have to stop protecting kids so that they can grow up. There has to be a balance. For example, there's been research on the playgrounds of my childhood versus the playgrounds of your childhood. Okay, so when I was a kid, we had playgrounds made out of concrete and metal, right? So we had big tall metal swings with metal chain link rails on the swings. We had metal slides that would get super hot in the summer. In fact, I broke my arm in first grade sliding down one of these big metal slides, big tall jungle gyms and climbing towers. And there was not the same emphasis on safety back then that there is today. Okay, so today, if you go to a playground, everything is made out of nice, soft plastic. The ground is usually covered either with bark or some kind of really squishy matte material. Nothing super tall, nothing's metal that could heat up. Okay, it's all very color coded and happy. And they've done research, and the research has shown, number one, the playgrounds of today just aren't as fun as the playgrounds from when I was growing up. But number two, when I was growing up, the playground would teach you resilience, okay? You learned things that you just don't learn on the playgrounds of today. So you learn that if you, swing too high in the swing and jump out, that you can fall and get hurt, so that's an important lesson. And you also learn that, let's say you skin your knee and it's bleeding and you're crying, but after a while, the pain goes away. And you put a Band-Aid on it, and lo and behold, it heals, and you realize, hey, that hurt, but it's not the end of the world. So you learn this ability to pick yourself up and try again, and you learn how to learn from pain. Okay, so basically, you can go too far in terms of being overprotected for the children. When people say they're doing things for the children, you have to be aware of propaganda. California is a great example of this. When I was growing up, we didn't really have car seat laws for kids. But when I was raising my own kids in California, I felt like I was in a race against the car seat laws, because at first you only had to have car seats for kids that were under 2 years old and under 20 pounds. And then right when my first child hit 2, they changed the law. Now you have to be 4 years old and 40 pounds before you can be released from the car seat. Right when my child turned 4, lo and behold, if you're 6 years old and under 60 pounds, you still have to wear a booster seat. And I'm thinking at some point, petite women are going to have a problem here driving the car. They're going to need car seats too. At some point, it just gets ridiculous. So you have to find the right balance. Find the balance between protecting the children, but also saving room for freedom. I'm going to pick on Joe Biden just a little bit here. This is a picture of President Obama signing Obamacare into law. Obamacare was his signature piece of legislation trying to make health care affordable for families. And you can see here's Joe Biden. He has his hands on the shoulders of this very cute little kid, right? And so the implication is we're passing Obamacare for the benefit of cute little kids like this one. The intent of Obamacare was good. Do we want to make sure all families have access to health care? Yes, that's an important goal. However, every government action comes with a trade-off. And that's what we have to evaluate. The regulations under Obamacare are very complicated, and they have had some unintended consequences. Some people argue Obamacare is too expensive, and it takes away too much of our freedom. So even if we're implementing a government policy for the children, the question is, what are the trade-offs? You have to think about that and not let your emotions be swayed by a cute little kid, even a kid as cute as this one that's being manhandled by Joe Biden. Okay, let's do a quick review here. What is a way that we can remember which amendments are from the Reconstruction era and which amendments are from the Progressive era? Well, Reconstruction refers to the period of rebuilding after the Civil War. So you can recall that these 3 amendments relate to integrating the former slaves into American life. So the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment required the states to provide equal protection and due process. In other words, to treat people equally and fairly. And finally, the 15th Amendment abolished race restrictions on voting. Okay, so those are all part of rebuilding the country after the Civil War. Then we get to the Progressive era. Again, quick review. The Progressives believed in progress. They believed in an efficient, centralized national government. How are you going to pay for that? We have the 16th Amendment that implements the income tax so that you can pay for bigger government. We have the 17th Amendment that provides that senators will be elected directly by the people. So this emphasizes the link between the people and the national government, kind of does an end run around the states, because remember, as the Constitution was originally set up, the state governments selected the senators, but now state governments are no longer in that equation. We have prohibition, which is the prohibition of alcohol, where the progressives kind of overstep their bounds. Everybody can agree on that. And then finally, the 19th Amendment, giving women the vote, expanding the idea of freedom and equality. So those are the amendments from the Progressive era. Okay, let's keep moving in our discussion of American history. Next, crisis. From 1929 to 1941, Americans suffered through a Great Depression. This was the greatest domestic crisis to date. Not only that, by the time the Great Depression was over, we were also entering the Second World War. We had a very strong president at this time, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, also known as FDR. He pushed the expansion of government through his New Deal reforms. So the idea is, here's another crisis, the government must respond. Milestones of the New Deal included the Social Security Act, so providing retirement income for seniors, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulated the stock market. So they had all kind of banking reforms, welfare, public works programs, stimulus, trying to inject public money into the economy. Okay, so our modern presidents, President Obama was not the first one to come up with the idea of stimulus, of spending government money in the economy. FDR did that during the Great Depression. He was a very powerful president. He actually served for 12 years, so 3 terms. We'll talk more about this when we get to the presidency, but at the time, presidents were allowed to keep running for re-election just like members of Congress. That was shut down, and we now have term limits for presidents under the 22nd Amendment. With all of these reforms that were being proposed at the state and national level, there was some question, are they constitutional? Are they within the powers of the national government under Article 1, Section 8, that list? And so the Supreme Court actually was resistant to some of these New Deal reforms. They struck down some of these reforms, claiming that they were unconstitutional. So there was kind of a showdown between FDR and the courts. What happened is FDR put political pressure on the Supreme Court, and he said, look, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that there have to be 9 justices on the Supreme Court. This is something we'll talk about a little later in the course. We do have 9 justices today, but that's not required under the Constitution. So FDR said, what I'll do is I'll go to Congress, I'll ask Congress to expand the size of the Supreme Court, and then I can appoint more justices who will basically overrule you guys and allow my New Deal reforms to go through. This was a little bit, aggressive on FDR's part. It was not a politically popular move, but it did have the result that the Supreme Court became more flexible. So one of the justices that had been overturning the New Deal reforms, he retired. Another one of the justices started changing his opinions, and gradually the Supreme Court let more of these laws pass through, quit challenging them on a constitutional basis. Again, the Depression ended about the time that America entered World War II, and during these times of crisis, the government became stronger than ever. Big government was here to stay. So we're moving from one crisis to another. From 1955 to about 1975, so about 20 years, Americans were fighting a war in Vietnam that continued to escalate, and eventually we lost the Vietnam War. Not only that, but the 1960s and 70s were a time of social change and protests. So you had the civil rights movement, you had the hippie counterculture, you had the sexual revolution, which had a huge impact on American society. So again, it was a time of change, of unrest, and again, we had a strong president that used that time of uncertainty to move in with stronger national government. President Lyndon Johnson, he was also known as LBJ. He was actually a protege, a member of FDR's administration, and he has some similarities to FDR. During this time of change, he envisioned a great society supported by government initiatives. As part of this great society, he declared a war on poverty. His great society also created Medicare and Medicaid, so health insurance for our seniors and for poor people in the United States. His war on poverty also created food stamps, the food stamps program. He made 226 major legislative requests to Congress, including requests for federal aid to education, to the environment, to arts, to broadcasting, to transportation. Federal aid to the poor actually tripled from about $10 billion a year to $30 billion a year, so increased by a factor of 3. I want to read to you from one of President Johnson's speeches. This is a speech he gave to college students at the University of Michigan in 1964, and he's trying to cast his vision for the Great Society. So here's an excerpt from that speech. He says, "The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we are totally committed in our time. But that is just the beginning. The Great Society is a place where every child can find knowledge to enrich his mind and to enlarge his talents. It is a place where leisure is a welcome chance to build and reflect, not a feared cause of boredom and restlessness. It's a place where the city of man serves not only the needs of the body and the demands of commerce, but the desire for beauty and the hunger for community. It is a place where man can renew contact with nature. It's a place which honors creation for its own sake and for what it adds to the understanding of the race. It is a place where men are more concerned with the quality of their goals than the quantity of their goods. But most of all, the Great Society is not a safe harbor, a resting place, a final objective, a finished work. It is a challenge constantly renewed, beckoning us toward a destiny where the meaning of our lives matches the marvelous products of our labor." So the Great Society sounds pretty good, right? Who wouldn't want to have abundance and liberty for all and knowledge and an end to poverty and racial injustice? First of all, there's a word for places like the Great Society. They're called utopias. Okay, so utopia is this place. Sounds awesome. Sounds like a place where everyone would want to be, but unfortunately, it's an imaginary place. And how do you get to utopia anyway? Basically, President Johnson was saying that we can get there through federal government programs. If we just get the right program in place, we can find the Great Society. Johnson also signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act was an attempt to stamp out discrimination by private businesses and employers. And so we have the question, you know, it's been quite some time, over 50 years, and we have the question, okay, has poverty been conquered? Did we win the war on poverty? How about racial injustice? You know, has racism gone down in the United States? Do we have racial harmony that you would expect in a great society? And I'd have to say, you know, we probably have fallen short here, despite all the government programs and efforts and money thrown into these programs. As you can see, the national government was very busy between Wilson's New Freedom and FDR's New Deal, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, a very active national government, and they were not doing this by constitutional amendment. They found a way to expand the powers of the national government by reinterpreting the language in the list of powers in Article 1, Section 8. Some of the language in that list is a little squishy, especially as we talked about the Commerce Clause, because almost everything ends up in the stream of interstate commerce or could end up in trade between states. There's also the Necessary and Proper Clause. So the national government was taking advantage of the squishiness of the language of Article 1, Section 8, as well as a very friendly Supreme Court that was no longer overturning laws to effect federal programs. And so they were generally able to accomplish what they wanted without amending the Constitution. So during the 60s and 70s, the 1960s and 1970s, there were some constitutional amendments, but these really focused on mechanics, who could vote. 23rd Amendment. 23rd Amendment gave residents of Washington, D.C. the right to vote for president. So Washington, D.C. is our capital district, and it's actually not part of any state. So Washington, D.C. is not represented in Congress, and at the time, they also did not have a vote for the president. One thing that happens when you see the expansion of the national government and the powers of the government and the amount of money spent by the government, you'll also see an expansion of the capital district. So the capital district got wealthier and more influential and more populated. And the people who lived in Washington, D.C. said, look, you know, we should have some representation. We should at least be able to vote for president. And so we ratified the 23rd Amendment, which gave residents of Washington, D.C. the right to vote for president. So they have 3 electoral college votes, which is the same as the smallest state. We'll talk more about the electoral college in a later lecture. We have the 24th Amendment abolishing poll taxes. So before the 24th Amendment, states had the ability to charge a fee, to charge a tax in order to vote. And this was seen as suppressing the vote. What if you were poor, or what if the poll tax fell disproportionately on people from certain ethnic backgrounds? So the idea was that voting should be free to all citizens. You shouldn't have to pay to vote. So the 24th Amendment abolished poll taxes. Finally, we have the 26th Amendment. Again, at the time, each state could set its own voting age. 26th Amendment set one uniform voting age. So anyone over 18 has the right to vote under the 26th Amendment. These amendments to the Constitution, again, focused on the process, focused on expanding the vote. Now we get to the 1980s and 1990s, and there was kind of a backlash. Americans became concerned about the growth of government. So this backlash was led by, among other people, President Ronald Reagan. And part of the concern had to do with the Cold War against communist Russia, the USSR, the Soviet Union. Okay, And so there were stories coming out of the Soviet Union under this communist dictatorship where the government owned everything and controlled everything. And there were stories coming out of the Soviet Union that people were starving, that there was no food in the stores, that people were having to wait in long lines to get bread. And not only that, that there was persecution of political dissidents, that people were being sent to gulags and work camps simply for disagreeing with the government. And so kind of in response to that, Americans thought, our government has really been growing quite a bit and has become more and more powerful. And what's the end game here? Is the end game some kind of communist totalitarian system? And that doesn't look very good to us. So there's kind of this conservative backlash, the idea that maybe we want to take a few steps back and decide should we embrace large government the way that we have been doing up to this time. So President Reagan, he focused on the traditional role of national government, which was defense, and he did his best to cut taxes and cut non-defense spending. Again, that's very difficult because people tend to like their government subsidies. They become dependent on them. But Reagan was able to make some cuts in taxes, make some cuts in regulation, and America enjoyed a strong economy under Reagan. Reagan was a former actor from California, and he was very charismatic, and he had some phrases that he's known for. For example, he said that as government expands, liberty contracts. So he recognized this trade-off between growth of government and the shrinking of freedom, and he wanted to correct that balance. Here's another Reagan quote. Government is like a baby, an alimentary canal with a big appetite at one end and no sense of responsibility at the other. So like a big tube, like a baby that eats and eats and eats, and then, when it comes time to change the diaper, the baby's not responsible for that. Here's another one. Government's view of the economy could be summed up in a few short phrases. If it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. He also said, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. So Reagan had a message of reliance on yourself, reliance on your community, reliance on your private businesses, and maybe not being so eager to accept the help from the government that always comes with strings attached in the sense of decreases in our liberty. So this period saw the end of the Cold War, the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, and it was a very happy time in the economy. People felt pretty good about things, and it was a good time to think about the role of government. So the conservative backlash under Ronald Reagan was pretty short-lived. Government has continued to expand in the new millennium. We have new crises and new government responses. For example, we had the 9/11 terror attacks that were quite frightening. Under President George W. Bush, America responded with the Patriot Act. That was a law passed by Congress, and it was somewhat controversial. It allowed electronic eavesdropping in order to intercept potential terrorist messages, okay? But it also decreased our privacy in our electronic communications. There was also a massive reorganization of federal agencies under the new Department of Homeland Security, DHS. Look at that emphasis on security in contrast to our freedoms. There was a new government agency, TSA, Transportation Security Administration. That's the agency that's responsible for airport screening. So you can see the government growing, the emphasis on security. Then there was a recession. The economy crashed in 2008. The government was worried that the banks would fail, so President Bush signed a bank bailout using government money to help prop up the banks. President Obama continued and expanded these policies. So he supported a bailout of the automobile manufacturers, and he also supported an $831 billion stimulus package to try and jumpstart our economy. And of course, there was President Obama's signature legislation in 2010, Obamacare, where the government regulated the health insurance industry and provided subsidies to people who were having trouble affording health insurance. Okay, so the national government has continued to expand. The population is pretty divided about all of this. Should the national government be this powerful? And if yes, who's going to be the beneficiary, right? Because there's always going to be a beneficiary of national government policies. And this division is how we got someone like President Trump into office, somebody that's an outsider, somebody that's unpredictable, and we'll have to wait and see, will President Trump be able to ratchet back the power and the regulatory, all the red tape involved with the national government. He's made some efforts toward that. He's come under a lot of criticism as well. And today we're facing yet another crisis, the coronavirus crisis, where many, if not most, American businesses are experiencing some form of shutdown to try and contain the spread of the virus. This is causing another serious impact on our economy. The government is discussing all kinds of different measures where they can step in and provide us with stability and security. And the question is, what are we going to have to give up in exchange? What freedoms will we no longer have after this crisis has passed? Something to think about. Please prepare for the next lecture. We're going to be talking about Congress. If you could read Federalist Essay 62, that will help you be prepared for the next lecture. Any questions, please email me. Thanks for being with me during this lecture, and we'll see you next time.